I think it's part of the challenge to get myself out of my comfort zone and maybe share, really just share stuff that I've learned and hopefully interests other people and maybe others would want to share.
What was that moment when you were like, okay, privacy might actually be like something to consider or think about?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In one of my previous companies I worked at, it was a medical device company.
Hmm.
And so we were under FDA regulations and we were collecting both PII, so personal identifiable information, but also protected health information, which was actually part of what was needed for the product to function. And actually, it had an AI model that if patients gave their consent, we could use their data anonymized, but to train the model.
Hmm.
The interesting twist there was that the company's customers were actually healthcare providers. It's not the patients that were using the device. So the company was a little bit removed, but still was collecting the during the treatment they were collecting the data. And so that was important, and understanding that distinction was important. But it was really at another company where we were looking into supporting GDPR, where I really understood and dug deeper into that privacy is not just tagging the information, knowing what you collect and identifying it and deciding where to store it. It's actually a lifestyle, if you like. It's how a company thinks about the whole concept of collecting data, putting customers and employees at risk. What does that actually mean? And the responsibility we have on that. So that actually showed me how broad the topic of privacy really is.
Hmm. Yeah,
And that
no, yeah, no, that's yeah, that definitely makes sense. I wanted to point up or double click kind of into your conversation where you mentioned like all the HIPAA regulations and how that previous company was focused. It was kind of removed from the actual what we consider like data subjects or the people whose data was actually there. Um, was that like how do you feel like that kind of affected? Did that affect kind of company culture around data? Was that something that you kind of noticed at all, or looking back maybe in hindsight, do you see was there like a did that how do you feel like that effect kind of happened with the distancing that the company had?
it was on the one hand distancing, yet we needed that data from the patients to improve our model. So we
Yeah.
did have an incentive to and a responsibility to get and keep that consent, so
Hmm.
that if somebody did not want to consent, we had to make sure that we still had that responsibility, though we were not directly connected. So we took that responsibility obviously very, very seriously, as well as the importance of anonymizing that data. And so we also ended up, I'm not sure if it was really thought of from the beginning, but we had two separate databases. So actually, customer and more sensitive data was in one environment and business data was somewhere else. That helped as well. I
Hmm.
think that I probably would do something similar. It just ended up being a good choice. Um, but definitely there's a lot. We understood the benefit definitely of collecting that data because it could train our model more. So there's that incentive to collect it, yet to respect the patient's uh, requests was really important.
Yeah. That yeah, completely agree. And I think that's HIPAA has been an area that I've been actually trying to learn a lot more about just because I've been focused a lot more on like global kind of policy stuff. But when we look at like HIPAA and that being the main driver in the US, it's really interesting just the number of like organizations that really rely on it, and especially in the healthcare field, obviously, is what it's directed towards. Um, Trying to see kind of how that translates outside of the healthcare business at the same time, like trying to take those regulations and moving them kind of outwards or more broadly. Um, I would love to, so like what is kind of your role now, or where did you I would love to get like a little bit of a trail on kind of how you got to the position that you're at now, working with like a lot of enterprise technologies. And I would love to hear more about kind of how you almost like grew up into this space.
Yeah, good question. So I started actually my career in software development, so very far away from the enterprise,
Hmm.
and actually was responsible for feature roadmaps and delivering those features and stuff, which really play and could get and should be impacted by privacy. Uh, but over time, I realized that churning out these features was very disconnected actually from the company's operations, like its connection with its customers, whether it could deliver, manufacture, and even deliver its products, or there were outside forces like a factory that's stopped manufacturing or a paper mill that got shut down by a government that actually prevented products from being manufactured and sold. And the world of releasing features seemed very disconnected.
Hmm.
And so I transitioned, did my MBA at MIT Sloan as a first step, and then started to transition into more enterprise technology in the operations space. So taking my technical experience, but transitioning it into the systems and the data that drive a business versus drive the product on its own. But I think one thing I've seen through privacy is the overlap between these two things. And so thinking about how a product would be used and what it means for a customer,
Hmm.
how that data would be stored, how a business would use it, but then what does it mean on the features? Does that feature make sense or not, given the risk that it could put the business and the customer in? So it's almost like a full circle at the end, that there is this connection between the enterprise technology and the data that drives the business and helps it operate and be profitable, and the features and the products that it's creating. So it's been an interesting space, and it's been nice to see how it's transferable experience and skill sets. Um, so it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting journey, and I'm really excited and appreciate you getting the time to kind of talk about it because I think when we like, I feel like privacy is going through like a lot of changes, right? And we're learning a lot and trying to kind of grow this privacy industry that in a lot of ways is mirroring that of security or mirroring that of normal software development, in both like the tooling as well as like methodology. And so I'm really excited to learn more. And our conversation, I would love to learn more about kind of like the operational side, or when we talk about like enterprise technology and driving adoption from like an enterprise level. And you have a lot of great experience outside of privacy, but I think as an industry, and you have a lot of interest in privacy at the same time, we can learn a lot from hopefully your experience in doing a lot of this enterprise technology and how we might apply that to kind of privacy work. And so that's what I'm super excited about. Um, so kind of starting off that, one of the key things that I would love to, and I've had struggles with this, is like kind of top level buy-in on services and tools and stuff. So whether it's like privacy specific or just in general, I would love to kind of walk through like what are kind of your thoughts and first thoughts on trying to get kind of buy-in from like an enterprise technology standpoint with executives.
I was saying earlier that it's the enterprise stuff that keeps a company running, but
Hmm.
it's the product that is sold. And so even though the former keeps the company running, most of leadership is actually focused on the product and what the product does.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times what I've found though is that the enterprise piece, the IT piece, is sort of seen as sometimes an afterthought. Sometimes that, hey, we've decided on the strategy, now let's see how the technology can support this, versus actually seeing that this is not an extra cost. This is actually what makes the business run and actually can give us a competitive advantage.
Hmm.
And I think in order to get executive buy-in and buy-in at all levels of a company to the importance of this technology, whether it's investing in a new ERP or investing in changing how teams work together, or it's in investing in privacy, and there is a cost involved in that. It can only really get done once the executive team really understands the value and the importance and the edge that this technology can give. And a lot of it is, I think, on the technical folks to get that buy-in and do that by simplifying in simple English and not lose people in technical jargon,
Yeah.
and why this is important, and to give examples of how this can help. Because a lot of times it's true, it's a hidden cost. It's not something that customers would see if you're actually implementing a more efficient way for a customer to ask to be forgotten, right? And remove all their data. It's not something that you can put on your website, but the fact that you've reduced it from being 4 people in total taking an hour each, it's now taking a few seconds. It's hard to really quantify that as beneficial. And so trying to find those numbers and make a good case for it is a way to appeal to the sort of dollars and cents side of it, but there's also to the appreciation that technology is a partner in this, not just the product and sales and finance, but also the technology, I think, should have a seat around the strategy table.
Yeah.
I want I'd lie if I say it's not a challenge,
Yeah.
but it's a challenge for the more of us, that talk about it, the more we can maybe move the needle.
No, definitely agree.
Oh,
When you're talking about kind of like you mentioned, obviously like making it more efficient was one of the examples that you gave, where like you're reducing the number of people necessary to work on stuff. That can kind of come down to like this dollar value of like dollar of labor costs, right? Is most everything kind of has to come down to money, I assume, or how can we kind of like show dollar kind of savings over time, kind of thing? Because when we talk about security, it's not if a security breach happens, it's when a security breach happens. So it's almost like when we talk about privacy, we have to be talking about this when as well. And I think that's almost less accepted. But have you had more success, I would say, or do you find it more successful to talk about it from like an enterprise risk perspective or from like a monetary perspective? Any ideas or thoughts around that with enterprise technology?
it's a challenge because it's a little bit like an insurance policy, right?
Yeah.
It's always very difficult for people, and people tend not to want to think of the worst case scenario and say, maybe I can do without the insurance, or maybe I'll pay a minimum for it, or how much is the risk? And when you speak to the lawyers, the general counsel in the company, they'd make it, uh, uh, raise the risk and make things seem as bad as possible.
Mhm.
There's, on the other hand, the finance would probably want to keep it as low as possible to keep the spend low. So how to make it so it's realistic, so you can really get buy-in from people and they really agree that, hey, this is a reasonable risk for us. I think sort of maybe going through an approach of doing a risk matrix and bringing all the right stakeholders, including the executives, to understand this is what we went through, this is what we have identified, and this is how we've come up with the risk and the price tag that goes to implement it, and the price tag that potentially could be hit if we do not implement it. That's one way. Another way, obviously, that helps as a forcing function is when you need to comply with something like GDPR in order to sell in Europe. So
Yeah.
that's easy for people to understand, right? It's either we can open up into that market or we can't. But like you say, that's not always made that easy. I think it's taking the right leadership together with the technology folks in the journey of how did we come to this decision. We're not asking for this big investment out of, pulling it out of thin air, or that we did this analysis. Let's look together at the analysis and see if you have objections, that's fine. Versus, okay, just give the bottom line this is what we're asking for in order to implement this. I think like most decisions or most change processes, if you bring the people you are making the change together with you along in the process, it's easier to drive it. But again, it always will compete. And I think that's what the technical people have to keep in mind. It does compete against investment in product or investment in, marketing campaigns or whatever else the company is doing. So keep that in mind, and perhaps also taking industry benchmarks and seeing comparable companies that are collecting similar data or that and can be used. And perhaps even that's where collaboration can happen with other CIOs or security officers that would be willing to come and talk and say, hey, this is what we did, and maybe help in that way. Because I think there's a lot of, at least what I've come across is a lot of forums and people that are open to talk, and not a lot of companies that are not competing might be willing to do that. And that can give just one other data point to help make decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of different like data points, taking in a lot of different information from different sources, and like you said, trying to bring a lot of people together to almost kind of share common language or try to like be on the same page about understanding the goals around that. But that also kind of sounds like a challenge to get all these voices together, right? Like in trying to as the person at the center, or as a privacy engineer, kind of at this being at the center of that, it's like trying to balance everybody's kind of ideas almost at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of maybe project management element to
Mm-hmm.
the data privacy engineer piece, because you have to build this consensus. Nobody is going to do that unless you're able to find some other partner within the team you're working in or your company who can be your champion to help that happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. It's sort of outside of the job description, perhaps, but it's a must-have to really be able to do it. It's funny. I think a lot of times at the end, the actual technical work is much easier than getting the consensus and the support,
Yeah.
and also getting agreement on the scope. How much are you going to do? What are you going to decide not to do intentional? And how much are you going to spend on it? Um, that is sort of the 80-20 rule, I think.
Okay. Like 80% of the work goes to all the people management side.
Yes, they're getting the consensus. Once you
Yeah.
do, you just go running with the technical and it's done within.
Yeah, no, I definitely I can echo that. That makes sense. Um, when you mentioned some stuff around like regulations and using those kind of as we look at, and I look at it a lot of stuff as like you use the carrot or the stick, right? Like you can either dangle the positives in front of organizations or try to like push the positives of this is what is like right for our customers. This is the ethical thing to do. We need to have like the right things happening, or you have the stick of kind of um like the compliance aspect or the fines and stuff coming around. Like what is like, I feel like the stick is maybe not as nice, but it definitely, I think, pushes more people. Um, is that kind of the idea that you have, or in your experience, that kind of you want to try to lead with the carrot, but a lot of times people need a stick to push at least with enterprise technology.
Yeah, it's much easier to understand.
Okay.
So it's a gating factor. So for example, the company I worked at, like I said, that it was an FDA regulated device. You couldn't, every country the company was selling at needed to get its FDA equivalent approval. So
Mm,
it wasn't you could do without it or decide to do less of it or whatever. It was very clear. And then that was an easy decision. It had to be done if you wanted. But I think it always comes back to versus the business case of actually entering the new market or whatever this regulatory
mhm.
requirement is sort of preventing the company from doing. If complying with it makes it actually be prohibitive, then it could be that it's killing the whole project. So is there a way, and I think that's where it's important for the technical person to work closely with the business person to understand what is the business case that's being built here, right? How much of the upfront cost is needed to even get into this market? And what about what it would be eating away from future revenue in order to support that? And does this still comply with sort of the margin that the company is looking for? And are there different ways of approaching it that makes it more lucrative than others, where there is flexibility? Like privacy does have a leeway there, right? It depends on FDA might not, but privacy does. And so how
Yep.
do you build that? Again, I think it comes back to maybe again that risk matrix and making
Yeah.
that risk matrix, aligning that matrix also with the business case. Um, and you know, regulations change, right? So
Yeah.
even if you're complying currently with one thing, like CCPA is relatively new. So even if you're currently selling in the US, suddenly you're feeling this change that has come from this new regulation. It's not even expanding into a new market. It's actually just being able to sell in your previously existing market. So, but constantly making sure, I think that's the thing with enterprise technology, is that it comes to support the enterprise. So it has to be in such a way that it's not prohibiting the business from running, right? That it's
Mhm.
able to scale, right? So one company I was at, the ERP, it just reached its limits long before, and it was worth the company to invest millions of dollars to transition to a much larger one because the company had grown so much. Actually, the ERP was preventing the company from entering new markets.
Mm.
That was, you know, it made sense for the business. So making sure that your investment in technology does not prohibit the business. So
Yeah, and specifically privacy. I mean, you mentioned the regulations are changing a lot. It's maybe not. It's looking at, like I said, the kind of the future proofing of the solutions. Looking at it from like, okay, we need to. We're either looking at new markets or we know that privacy is going to be changing a lot. What are, instead of maybe getting this vendor who will cover all the baselines but might not move as quickly, we go with a vendor that we know is going to move faster or be more adaptive to regulations like when they kind of come out.
no, no,
Yep.
that's a really good point. And I think the more, as things are more SaaS based, they
Mm,
tend to be right. The vendor themselves can push releases and updates and stuff, but also there are vendors who would work with you, right? Constantly proactively and telling, hey, this has changed. This is what we recommend you do. So I think it's also more looking at a overall partnership with a vendor you work with
hmm.
versus time buy and then that's it. I think
Yeah.
that is sort of tends to be at least the direction. And the vendors I personally prefer to work with are those who have that attitude.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I don't like, I like to be able to just send a quick message to somebody or have like this like collaborative experience, because as a technologist myself, I want to be able to like voice concerns and have a company that's actually going to like agree or like listen to the concerns and like grow from that. And I've had the companies that I partner with, I've had great experiences with people who are like really interested. And so after that, it's like you can't go back to somebody who has all this red tape to just put in a bug ticket. Like your software is broken and you're making me do more hoops than it is for you to actually fix it.
Agreed.
Um yeah, so kind of looking at in kind of the same vein, but moving more towards like I would love to hear from your perspective. We're talking about kind of executive buy-in and a lot of this like operational work, risk, kind of getting communication upwards and getting that buy-in. How have you, over the years that you've been kind of working in the industry, seen like executive buy-in, maybe around technology, in general and enterprise solutions in general? How has that changed? And then if you can also talk a little bit about like maybe privacy specifically, is there, I'm hoping as somebody into privacy that more executives are like, hey, we got to pay attention to privacy stuff. But what's kind of your experience in that area?
I've seen that When something is broken, executives are willing to invest whatever it takes to fix. And then it's a very easy and well-defined project or a program, or it's made into one of the pillars in the company. And then as that's being eaten away at and improvements are being made, and that problem goes away, often it's then, unless it's burning again, it's difficult to get as much
Mhm.
support. And partly it could be that it's again comes back to explaining in very simple terms, what is it that the technology is coming to do? What else is broken? What else are we addressing? In telling the right, I've heard several times being able to be a good storyteller. So how can you create, and it's hard for technology people, definitely for me
Yeah.
to tell a story. But if you can tell the story to the business of what you're coming to change in the enterprise and the foundations that are running the business from a technology perspective, and they can gravitate to that story, then it's easier to get support. When I stick to just the technical jargon, whether it's defining a process that we're fixing or changing the tools and where data is stored and how data will move and what people lose it. And then there is very difficult to get financial backing for it, and also just resources and in general an appreciation even for what the technical enterprise technology team is doing.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of it is on the leadership to really articulate in an effective way that the way the rest of the business that's not technical can understand and appreciate. I think that also, again, these are just some of my learnings and reflections. It's helping her, and specifically, like I said, around the privacy space, is how understanding that supporting privacy, it means not just the checkbox of, hey, we can comply with whatever regulation. We're
Mhm.
also going to change the way our company operates, the way teams work with each other, and the way we think about our customer. And I think if more executives understand that, and that some of that does not even requires more resources to be put on this. It's just changing, and it's a mind shift change, right? So, for example, if we look at GDPR has very clear, if in its checklist, it has a very clear requirement for the data protection impact assessment to be done, a DPIA,
Mhm.
right? For any feature that's going to be developed, there has to be sort of a one pager or whatever a company wants to define it as. What are we going to do? New data are we going to collect on the customer, and why? And even just having that be a request as part of a, requirements document, having that be there and having that be reviewed, right? It's written by product management, but having that be reviewed early on by the software team and the data engineering team,
Yep.
and perhaps the legal team, and everybody understands and asks the question of, why are we collecting this new data? What risk are we putting our customer in? And will the customer get sufficient value to offset the risk of us collecting more data on them? Having those conversations up front, understanding the context, right? Because I think a lot of times, coming from the software world, if a feature comes down and the engineers don't understand the context of why this feature is needed and how it's going to be used, it makes it much harder to develop it. So having these context discussions up front
Mhm.
actually makes the end piece, again, the 80-20 rule. It makes the development run faster. And so having the executives appreciate that that is important, that really changes how a company works, and that is the type of company we want to be.
Mhm.
Actually using privacy as a reason to drive that change within the organization, or even as a framework. Like the DPIA is a great example of, hey, there's a framework here. Let's make the changes we need to comply with it. And then, oh, we're actually asking all our teams to think about the customer first. Uh, think about the risk, not just think about, oh, storage is so cheap. Let's collect this data. We'll figure out later what we're going to do with it. No, let's figure out upfront what we're going to do with the data.
Yeah.
More data, more risk. Is the risk justified? Will the customer get the sufficient benefit to do that? Do we need their consent? And will it entice them to agree and give us their consent, right? Because they feel they're going to get more value.
Hmm.
And so I think these are, I actually love it once I was digging more into the whole privacy and understood how broad it is and actually impacting almost, I'd say, close to the culture of the company. It's, I think a lot of executives should care.
Yeah. I mean, I think couldn't have said it better myself. No, that was such a great thought process, and I really appreciate you kind of sharing all of that. I mean, you talked like really eloquently about like the challenge of like something's broken and we're going to invest time in fixing that broken thing, but companies don't invest the time in the like longer term kind of reasons why that broke. Maybe like it probably broke because we're not maintaining it or having like maintenance processes around it to like keep it up to date. And so you talked about a lot of like buy-in over time and the culture around the organization needing to make that shift for privacy. I thought that was yeah, really just well said. And then you talked about like privacy by default in ways that like for me it's I would just say privacy by default and data minimization and all these like industry kind of buzz terms, but you're again just how you translate that into like, okay, don't collect all the data even though storage is cheap, or yeah, have a couple questions in your kind of software planning documents that talk over like to help create that DPIA or data impact assessment or data protection impact assessment. Um, Doing those little things seem easy enough, but it's the culture and the changes that you have to kind of make around that. Um, I wanted to kind of again double click on this thought that you kind of mentioned around um, developing tools that make people almost like want to give the organization consent, right? You kind of mentioned that about like making something worth it that people are like, yes, I want to kind of you or like I'm happy with you guys processing my data because I'm getting something out of that. Can you speak to a little bit more about kind of your thought process around there? Because it's a unique perspective that I hope more organizations can kind of think about in that way.
Yeah, I think it's two things. Is one is what you're going to do with my data will bring me more value. I'll be able to maybe see something about myself that I couldn't before, and it'll help me in that way.
Hmm.
Let's say from a health perspective, or it will help me make better choices, whatever. And then I can see, okay, I see the value in that. I'm okay with giving you consent to collect that data for me. But also, I think it has to come hand in hand with me trusting that your organization is going to do the most it can to protect my data. Because even if I thought you were giving me value, but as an organization, I couldn't trust you, then I still wouldn't give my consent. And
Hmm.
that building trust, like you said, nothing is really 100, foolproof, and nothing is guaranteed. But
Yeah.
if a company does take that seriously, then at least it reduces the risk of hackers being able to get in and access data. You at least feel that as an organization that you've done the most you can to earn that trust from your customers. So I think it has to come both. A company that had been breached in the past, I think find it very hard, no matter how enticing the feature they're doing. And also maybe a third element to it is being very clear on why you're collecting the data, right? Some organization give you these long documents nobody reads, press accept at the bottom and just move on.
Yeah.
Make it in a really easily digestible format that is a quick read of why we're collecting and what we're going to do with it, so that people don't feel, hey, we're being whitewashed here. Something is just, nobody is thinking that we're going to read these 10 pages to give consent, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe that also falls a little bit in the trust, right? You're giving
Mhm.
it as it is. We're going to read it. If you've explained to us in simple language what you're going to do with the data, then I can probably trust that you're going to do the best you can to protect it and
Mm.
to respect it, and anonymize where you can, or not keep it for longer than you can. All those things that give me confidence that I'm exposing more, but only for the minimum amount of time that's needed, so that I get that benefit. So I
Yeah.
think it's these things together. And that, again, that reflects on the company's culture and how its employees behave, and probably even who it hires.
Hmm. No, yeah, I found that like that's very interesting how you were like the simpler and almost like more transparent or straightforward that you can present like these ideas. It's not that you, and at least this is your personal experience, and I would also echo that as my experience. If you can very clearly just tell me what you're using data for, I'm gonna have more trust that that's what you're gonna use it for. It's not like I'm gonna have more trust in your organization because I have to read this 19-page privacy policy. Like that's gonna actually make me less trustful. So it's this like weird, there's a lot of paradoxes when we talk about privacy, because there's a lot of people who like say that they care about privacy and then don't like actually act on it when they know that there's an organization that is not doing privacy well. And I think that's kind of hurts the industry's ability to really push for like innovation, because sometimes it doesn't feel like the general public is really acting in the best interest. And I think a lot of that comes down to like, I guess, education and stuff like that.
Yeah, and trust.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I would love to kind of as again doing kind of enterprise technology, and that's been kind of your focus. There's obviously like a lot of technologies that are going to have like overlap, or you're going to be kind of working on one tool that might overlap with others. And especially in privacy, I feel like every single tool has very similar kind of features of like a data map, and it'll tell you where your data is going and stuff like that. Um, what is kind of been your experience, or how do you manage kind of overlapping technologies, or do you have a preference on like a platform that will claims to do it all for you versus more niche kind of technologies that are brought in for like a specific purpose?
I think it's always difficult. A platform that tries to be everything for everybody doesn't tend to be, maybe specialize in any one specific area. On
Hmm.
the other hand, trying to integrate a bunch of different tools that each do a piece of it, that's difficult too, right? You have to make sure that the right data flows between them, and if one has changed its API or something, then it's the onus is on you to know the change and
Yeah.
stuff. So it really, I think it's when evaluating and determining these tools, it's looking at maybe what is, again, coming back to the risk matrix, what is it that is specific for your company? What is it
Hmm.
that most often happens? Like, is it a consumer facing company where people tend to often ask to be forgotten? So that piece of it, of being able to really efficiently delete the data that you've collected on people, that's the most important thing. Or maybe that doesn't happen often, and the more important is that you anonymize it as soon as you collect it, and you make sure that it remains anonymized. Or so that would be one aspect of looking at the risk, and obviously how much data you're collecting. The bigger the company, the harder it is.
Hmm.
And I've only worked in sort of more smaller companies, so I can't talk about companies that are,
Yeah.
ginormous. Um, but I think also with that comes, because if you're a bigger company, you tend to have a larger team to support this and more skills sets available. In a smaller company, you might have less data, but you also have smaller teams. You can afford smaller teams. So another aspect I would look at when evaluating tools is, how do I maintain the long run, right? There's the initial getting it up and running, but then there's the day-to-day and keeping it running, addressing when issues happen, and just evolving, right, as regulations change and things like that. And so I think understanding, do I have the right skill set in-house? If not, can I train someone? If not, do I need to hire? That all comes back to the executives looking at the bottom line and how much this supporting this is going to cost. So obviously there's that. And then how a platform scales, right? So if you're a small company now and you're hoping to grow, is that the cost of that privacy platform going to be prohibitive because it's not scaling in the way your business is? So looking at the current here and now, how quickly do I get up and running? Can I support it internally, or do I need another hire? Can this be a career growth for somebody in the team? And then how does it scale? Is the cost something that I can afford? Because sometimes things look very cheap at first, but then they grow and become prohibitive. And I'd say the last element of it is the company that you're buying from. As you're going through the evaluation process, do you connect with them and their values and the type of support you get, the type of answers they give? Are they there to help you be dependent on them or on one of their implementation partners? Or are they, which is what I prefer, is to be self-sufficient afterwards? They set up to allow you to be self-sufficient afterwards, or that's not actually their business model. So making sure that their philosophy and business model aligns with what's important for you. It could be that there are companies that say, I'm going to outsource this whole thing. I see things differently. I prefer the self-sufficiency, but it has to be a level that, it's something that's trainable, or we can find the skill set, and it's not a unicorn that we need to go find now. So I think all these aspects are ones that I would look at. And like I said, the trade-off between, do I want to integrate different pieces, or am I going to buy, the Swiss Army knife that's for everything? It's and it probably comes back to, having the right stakeholders in the team, including the business, right? How much are they willing to put down? What are the costs of these things? Costs to purchase, costs to maintain, costs to scale.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have, I guess, like experience or what are, like, obviously there's a lot of enterprise technologies that connect with, or the nature of kind of privacy technologies, that they have to be very like interconnected with a lot of these different services, like that. I feel like also kind of creates this, in some cases, like single point of failure, or like your privacy technology can become like a critical system on your platform. And I would assume, or that would change kind of how you look at or kind of approach some of these implementations, or at least management, right?
That's an interesting point. So I guess also it would be looking at the type of support, right? Their uptime and what they can, especially if it's mission critical, right? If they're down, then you can't do business. Then that's even more important. What uptime do they provide? Do they actually hold your data, right? Some of these privacy platforms actually don't hold your data at all. And so that means that they're one level of risk below. If they do hold it, then audit them and see what security measures they're taking, and think trying to find ones where they don't actually hold any of your data and everything is hosted in your environment. It actually limits that exposure. But it's a really good point that you're making, that if the privacy platform is something that is in the mission critical path, then that's a different level of due diligence that needs to get done. Sometimes it can run on non-mission critical. A lot of business data is not mission critical. It's part of a sale, and so that might reduce the overall. It could also change at what type of license you buy from them, or offering they have, whether it is part of your business critical or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a going to bring in
I mean,
to
in that similar vein, like I mean, I feel like this is not a privacy conversation if we don't talk about AI. What is, how does like the abstracts around AI and privacy, have you like interacted with that in enterprise technology at all, or any thoughts around those areas? And especially when you're talking about like who's storing the data, I mean, that's a huge conversation in AI, and who owns the data and training and the different LLMs and all the fun jargon and stuff. But
agree this, and especially that every vendor now wants to try and push an AI functionality into, whether it's, your instant messaging platform that you're using in your company, or your
yeah.
wiki, or whatever it is. They're all trying to find ways that can enable you, to write emails quicker. So but when we were evaluating, and a lot of companies are actually enticing you to be a beta partner, and so get
Mhm.
it for free right now. And so there's definitely that, but we always ask, um, how do they train their data, and what data do they use? Like, are they going to be using, where is it going to run? Is their large language model going to run actually on our servers? So they
Yeah.
got trained on different data, but the fine tuning of and is going to actually happen on our data. So, they install it, and then it would take a few days perhaps until it learns.
Mhm.
That's one thing. But I think, I'm not sure. I definitely would not feel comfortable having my data, running, and when somebody else is hosting a model. And so we've been very careful and selective at what we pick. And also, it hasn't been that easy to really, or to find a clear need so far to actually use it and take the risk that comes with it. So finding the right problem where
Yeah.
AI can really help. And I think that also helps, to sort of justify, am I willing to take that risk? But I think a lot of vendors who are adding AI today are very conscious of that, right? And they are finding ways that the model they've created ends up running in your environment.
Mhm.
Uh, but also there's the whole education piece, right, of employees on, be careful when you use
Yeah.
something in ChatGPT. Don't put any, I mean, now hopefully it's more well known than it was about a year ago.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think,
Hopefully.
the same way that we do monthly training on cybersecurity, I think
Mhm.
there should be similar training that goes on around AI and using it, especially free tools that are out there. It's often difficult for IT teams to even know people have created accounts. There are ways. Again, that's another investment in these tools. But it's training employees to know, hey, that there are implications to what you're doing, and you're
Yeah.
jeopardizing not just, your own data, but other company confidential data potentially, and other colleagues.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
there's more to do on that. I think we've gotten much better at cybersecurity. This has to be another layer of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like we started off the conversation talking about, I think privacy is following a lot of the same trends as enterprise technologies and security. Would love to, like, in looking at, again, your experience with these tools, leading these tools, looking at how we've grown in security and privacy so far. What do you have, like a trend, a prediction, like anything that you're expecting, or that you would love to kind of see privacy maybe like grow into more of, I guess, from like a technology standpoint?
I'm not sure if you'd call it privacy per se, but identifying, tying it with AI, and identifying whether the data that's
Mhm.
there is correct,
Okay.
or it's a hallucination, or
Yeah.
it's just false
Okay.
for a reason. I guess that comes back to the trust piece of it. And I'm not sure if that would it falls more on a sort of ethical AI, perhaps, or if privacy has some ways of playing into that. But I think
Mhm.
having people trust what they see and the data that's presented to them,
Yeah.
I think that would be where the biggest next big focus that's already happening, but it's very difficult to, I think, also enforce it afterwards.
Mhm.
Make sure that you know, companies really complying with that, and the different tools are they complying with it. That's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll piggyback off of that because there's both like the image kind of side of it where like is the image that we're creating, is the image that we're creating actually like a real image, or is like the text that we're creating like real or not? Both of those kind of do have some privacy considerations, and if we look at like the inverse of that statement where this is creating false information about maybe like a person, or false information, or falsely portraying an image or video about a specific individual. We have Will Smith eating spaghetti has been like our generative AI like video. We don't know if he actually eats spaghetti, right? So like if in trying to like see and just as it gets more and more realistic, it's going to become harder to kind of do that tags of understanding what's AI generated versus not. And yeah, I think that is a definitely like a privacy consideration that I think a lot of people are going to start kind of needing to focus on or figure out.
yeah, and how is a company using the data it's collecting on its customers to train its model?
Yeah.
What are you using that for? Is the customer okay with that? Um, that's going to be even not necessarily the developers of the large language models, but the ones that are trying to, there's the general models, and then there's making it specific for your company.
Yeah.
How are you using your customers' data to make that specific? Are they okay with that? Uh,
Hmm. Do you, I mean, and that's like a huge question for me or something I think about a lot. Like, do you feel like any of this generative AI is actually like following like privacy kind of consent? Like, do you think there's like, because I feel like there's a lot of the data that like, I mean, I probably posted as a teenager on Facebook, and I wasn't thinking that there was going to be this massive neural net that's taking all that data and learning about it. Is that I feel like that's definitely trying to reconcile like what that whiplash might look like when we start kind of seeing a lot of that data maybe popping up in these LLMs.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some of it already, right, by authors and other
Yeah.
producers of intellectual property, where they say, "Hey, you've been using my material." Uh,
Hmm.
so that's, I think, the fact that so much data is out there, whether legally acquired or not, there is so much. I think now there's much more awareness and maybe more, strict compliance that's need to be done. Maybe more audits will be done on something like, like you said, on Facebook.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that the bigger challenge will be with players that are not going to, that don't want to comply. It's going to be hard to find those. And
Yeah.
it's very invisible. And so it's hard to find versus something that, it's clear to see. So I think that's going to be making it'll be hard to identify there, right? There isn't a watermark that shows you, hey, this
Yeah.
is something that has been taken from somewhere, or this is AI generated and it's not real. That's going to be difficult.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I would love to get any final thoughts, final words from you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Would love to if you have anything that you're working on that you wanted to talk about, or any other final thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed our conversation as well. I think it just shows how driving privacy and in general the challenges that we have with the amount of data that we generate and we want to use, how that's an effort not just for technical teams. It's an effort
Mhm.
for everybody in the business to come together and feel that it's important to invest in and to appreciate and to try and understand some more. So, but like we said at the beginning, I think it's also on the technical teams to make a good case, tell the story in an easy way. So lots of good challenges, and nice to see so many different players out there providing and addressing these things. We'll see how they adapt also to all the AI stuff. So I'm
Mhm.
interested. Keep an eye out on that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, again, really appreciate your time. This was great, and I had a lot of fun. So thank you.
Thank you. Me as well.